A lot of times you can tell how a meeting's going to go when the press is allowed in and the leaders are allowed to speak. Both with President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, their remarks in front of the camera with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu were incredibly brief for how these usually go. Vice President Harris saying she looks forward to the conversation. President Biden saying they have a lot to talk about. So obviously sending the message that this was going to be a tough meeting. But more important is what we heard from Vice President Kamala Harris, who is likely going to be the Democratic nominee for president. Very different comments than we've heard from other Biden administration officials. She began, and again, these remarks were not on her schedule. The staff felt the need that she needed to come out here and make this point. And of course, there was the usual ironclad support for Israel. But then, more than we've heard from pretty much any U.S. politician at this level, there was a lot of discussion about the absolute horror that the people in Gaza are living through and dying. She talked about the numbers of starvations, the number of people who are food insecure, the number of people who've had to move several times. She talked about seeing pictures of dead children. And of course, to our audience, you might assume that that is a normal thing because we are seeing pictures of dead children. You don't see that in the U.S. media. You don't see it on the front pages of the newspapers, almost hardly at all. There is very little discussion about the plight of the people in Gaza. So she did spend quite a bit of time talking about that. But then I think the line that really summed up what her meeting was and what the message was for the prime minister, she said, talking about a ceasefire, it's time to get this done. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, Rami Khouri is a public policy fellow at the American University of Beirut, and he joins us now live from Boston. Thanks for joining us, Rami. Now, a strong statement there from the Vice President. She seemed to emphasise with the Palestinians, certainly not something we've heard from Joe Biden to that extent. But what do you think she was trying to achieve with that statement?
She was doing several things at the same time. She was reaffirming the established American position for total support for Israel always and forever. She was making a point that that support is not totally without any limits, that there has to be some concern for international law and decent behavior and other things that have to be respected in the way that Israel conducts its genocidal attack. She was sending a tremendously important message to the Palestinian people and everyone who supports them around the world, because for the first time ever, she was talking, even though it was only rhetoric, but it was unprecedented rhetoric, that both reaffirmed the self-determination requirement and statehood for the Palestinians, and more importantly, in my view, she humanized Palestinian people for the first time ever in my 50 years of following Palestinian-Israeli contestation in the United States. For the first time ever, we have a senior American official talking about children and mothers and families and starvation and people fleeing 3 times as real people. And this is an extraordinary symbol of possibly more changes to come. And finally, she was sending a message to the critical electoral constituency in the United States, mostly young people, progressive Jews, Arab and Asian Americans, Black and Hispanic Americans, others, church groups, many groups who have clearly said they do not support the genocide in Gaza by Israel that is done with American weapons and political support and money. And this constituency is big enough that it could deny the American presidency to the Democrats in November if nothing is done. So we saw her send 4 or 5 very important messages to very important constituencies.
Well, we'll get to that in a moment where you're talking about certainly the American public. But months ago, President Joe Biden announced a US-led ceasefire deal. We remember it was a plan that was to end the war in Gaza. They said that this was a US-led plan. That hasn't happened so far. Now, is her meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister likely to have made any difference or at least achieve anything in terms of this ceasefire deal?
We'll find out in the next week or so. What she's done is aligned the American position at the highest level, articulated in public very firmly, She's aligned that with the large constituency in Israel, especially the armed forces, that wants the ceasefire to happen immediately, because that's the best way for the Israelis to get back their hostages, most of whom are still alive, some are dead. So if there can be a convergence between the American official position, a major constituency in Israel, especially the armed forces, and the public, the likelihood is the pressure will become too great for Netanyahu to keep avoiding this.
Thanks very much, Rami. So much to unpick there in that statement. Thanks for joining us, Rami Khouri in Lebanon.
My pleasure.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.